Evelyn never expected to feel this way again. At 62, she had long settled into a comfortable rhythm of life, one filled with travel, good books, and occasional dinner parties with old friends. Romance, she thought, had been a beautiful chapter of her youth, one she cherished but didn't expect to revisit with the same intensity. But then there was James. 65, with salt and pepper hair and a confident charm that made her feel like a woman in her 30s again. They met at a jazz lounge one evening, introduced by mutual friends who suspected they might hit it off. And they did instantly. Their conversations flowed effortlessly and laughter came easily, but what captivated Evelyn most wasn't just the depth of their talks or the warmth in his eyes. It was the way he noticed the little things about her. The way she absent-mindedly played with the ends of her silver-streaked hair when she was thinking. The way she always hummed while stirring her tea. The way her eyes sparkled when she talked about a book she loved. James saw all of it, and though he never voiced it outright, these small gestures intrigued him, charmed him, pulled him in deeper each time they were together. What Evelyn didn't realize was that the things she did so naturally, things she had never given a second thought, were the very things that made her irresistible to him. It wasn't about youthful beauty or grand romantic gestures. It was about presence, about how she made him feel simply by being herself. She had no idea how much he loved watching her pull on his sweater absent-mindedly on a chilly morning, or how his heart swelled when she laughed at his dry humor, even when his jokes weren't all that great. And so their love story wasn't one of extravagant declarations but of whispered affections, unspoken glances, and the sexy, subtle moments that made every interaction feel electric. In a world that often glorified the rush of young love, they had found something even more intoxicating. An intimacy that came from knowing exactly who they were, from loving with confidence, and from appreciating the little things that made them fall for each other a little more each day. This is their story. The story of how the simplest gestures, the most unassuming habits, and the tiniest moments of affection could make love at any age feel more alive than ever before. The magic of hair play. James had always been a man who appreciated the details, the subtleties that others often overlooked. It wasn't just a woman's beauty that intrigued him, but the quiet, unintentional moments that made her who she was. And with Evelyn, one of those moments was the way she played with her hair. It was never deliberate, never done for attention, but every time she ran her fingers through her silver-streaked waves, James felt captivated. Sometimes she would twist a strand around her finger while deep in thought, her gaze distant as if she were lost in a world of ideas only she understood. Other times she would tuck her hair behind her ear mid-conversation, a small motion that somehow made her look even more elegant, more composed. On lazy Sunday mornings when they sat by the window with their coffee, he would watch as she absent-mindedly brushed her fingers through the soft strands, smoothing them out before letting them fall effortlessly back into place. It was mesmerizing, the way something so simple could feel so intimate, so uniquely hers. James found himself drawn to it in ways he never expected, noticing how her hair would catch the light when she flipped it over her shoulder, or how a few unruly strands would escape from her bun when they cooked together, forcing her to push them back with an exasperated but adorable sigh. He loved those moments most, the unguarded ones where she wasn't aware of how beautiful she was. When she laughed and let her hair fall in front of her face, only to push it back with a soft, casual grace, he wanted nothing more than to reach out and tuck it behind her ear himself, to let his fingers linger just a little longer against her skin. He knew she had no idea how sexy it was, how that tiny, unconscious act made his chest tighten with something deeper than attraction. It wasn't just about her looks. It was the way her presence was felt in every little thing she did, how her femininity was woven into the smallest of gestures. He had never told her how much he loved it, how sometimes when they sat close he would resist the urge to brush his fingers through her hair just to feel its softness, just to have an excuse to touch her. There was something intoxicating about it, something comforting yet alluring, something that made his world slow down whenever she did it. It was a kind of magic, an unspoken language between them, one that neither of them had to put into words. And as she sat across from him now, reading quietly with one hand absent-mindedly playing with the ends of her hair, James found himself smiling, knowing that he could watch her do this 1,000 times over and never get tired of it. Wearing his clothes. James hadn't expected to find something so undeniably attractive about such a simple thing, but the first time he saw Evelyn wearing his shirt, something in him shifted. It had happened so casually, One cool autumn morning she had pulled his soft, oversized button-down off the chair and slipped it on without a second thought. She hadn't done it to be seductive, hadn't even noticed the way he stood frozen for a moment, watching her move around the kitchen as if she had been wearing his clothes for years. The fabric draped over her, the sleeves a little too long, the hem hitting just at the top of her thighs, teasing the smoothness of her legs beneath. She looked effortless, comfortable, like she belonged in his space in a way that felt both natural and incredibly intimate. The scent of him lingered in the fabric, mixing with her own, creating something uniquely theirs, something that made his heart clench with an unexpected rush of warmth. She had no idea how much it affected him, how seeing her wrapped up in something of his made him feel a primal sort of possessiveness, not in a way that confined her but in a way that made him want to claim her again and again. There was something deeply sensual about it, the unspoken message that she felt at home with him, that she wanted his presence around her even in the simplest ways. As she stood by the stove, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, she gave him a sleepy smile, completely unaware of the way his gaze lingered, tracing the way his shirt shifted over her curves with each movement. When she reached up to push her hair back, the collar slid just slightly off her shoulder, revealing the soft skin beneath, and James had to look away for a moment, exhaling through his nose to steady himself. She wasn't trying to be alluring, wasn't attempting to capture his attention, but that was exactly what made it so irresistible. Later that morning, as they sat on the porch watching the world wake up, she stretched, the fabric pulling just enough to tease at what lay beneath, and James felt an ache settle in his chest, something deeper than attraction, something that felt like home. He wanted to tell her how beautiful she looked, how sexy she was without even trying, but instead he simply reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, letting his thumb brush over her skin in silent appreciation. Evelyn glanced at him, her lips curving into a knowing smile, as if she could read his thoughts without him saying a word. Maybe she could. Maybe she already knew that this was one of those little things, the quiet, unspoken moments that made a man fall a little harder, a little deeper without ever realizing it was happening. The impact of laughter. James had always prided himself on having a sharp wit, but it wasn't until Evelyn came into his life that he realized how much he craved the sound of genuine laughter, her laughter. It was the kind that filled a room, rich and warm, the kind that made people turn their heads just to see what was so funny. But what struck him the most was how easily she laughed around him, how she never held back, never tried to be demure or restrained. She had a way of throwing her head back when something truly amused her, eyes crinkling at the corners, the sound bubbling up from deep within her chest like music he never wanted to stop hearing. It wasn't just when he was actually funny, though he liked to believe he had his moments. It was the way she laughed at his worst jokes, the ones that made even him wince after saying them. She would roll her eyes, shaking her head with that teasing smile, but still she would laugh, sometimes at him more than with him, and he loved every second of it. There was a moment last week that had stayed with him longer than he expected. An evening at a quiet little Italian restaurant where they had been sharing a bottle of wine and reminiscing about their most embarrassing moments. James had shared a story about the time he had accidentally called his high school teacher Mom, in front of the entire class, thinking it would earn a polite chuckle at best, but Evelyn had laughed so hard she nearly choked on her drink. She had reached for his arm, squeezing as she gasped for breath, her forehead resting against his shoulder while she tried to compose herself, and he had never felt more utterly delighted by anything in his life. It was in those moments that he realized laughter wasn't just about amusement. It was about connection, about feeling completely at ease with someone, about knowing that no matter what, there would always be joy between them. She had a way of making everything lighter, of turning an ordinary moment into something memorable just by the way she reacted. Even in the quiet moments when they lay side by side on the couch, her legs draped over his as they watched an old black and white film, she would suddenly giggle at something small, a poorly delivered line, a dramatic pause that felt unintentional, and he would find himself laughing along just because her joy was so infectious. There was something incredibly sexy about it, the way she could make him feel youthful again, the way she reminded him that love wasn't always serious, that sometimes it was found in the simplest, silliest moments. And so, James made it his mission to keep her laughing, to pull that sound from her as often as possible, because if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was that a woman who laughed like Evelyn did was a woman who could make a man fall in love over and over again. Resting on his chest. There was something about the weight of Evelyn against him that settled James in a way nothing else ever had. It wasn't just physical closeness. It was the quiet surrender, the unspoken trust that came with the way she nestled against his chest at the end of a long day. She didn't do it for show, didn't even seem to realize how deeply it affected him, how it made him feel like the most needed, most cherished man in the world. It would happen in the stillness of the evening, after dinner had been cleared away and the two of them had settled onto the couch, the glow of the fireplace flickering across the room. She would sigh softly, that sound of complete relaxation, and shift toward him, resting her head against his chest, fitting against him like she had always belonged there. His arm would come around her instinctively, holding her close, his fingers tracing slow circles along her back, memorizing the warmth of her against him. He could feel the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing, could hear the faintest contented hum escape her lips as she settled in deeper. It wasn't something he had ever thought about before, but now he realized how much he craved these moments, how they made him feel like a protector, a safe harbor for her to retreat to. There was something indescribably intimate about it, more so than even the most passionate of embraces, because this was real, this was trust, this was love in its purest form. Sometimes she would drift off like this, her breath slowing, her body going lax against him, and he would smile to himself, reveling in the way she let herself be vulnerable in his arms. Other times she would simply lay there, her fingers tracing absent patterns over his shirt, her lips brushing softly against his collarbone as she murmured about whatever thought crossed her mind. And every time, James felt that ache in his chest, that deep, consuming affection that made him want to hold on to her forever. He had spent so much of his life standing tall, being the strong one, but in these moments she was the one grounding him, making him feel whole. He never told her how much it meant to him, never found the words to express how those quiet, stolen moments of her resting against him were the very thing that made him feel truly alive. Instead, he would simply tighten his arms around her, press a kiss into her hair and breathe her in, knowing that no matter what the world threw at them, they would always have this. The warmth, the closeness, the unshakable feeling of home they had found in each other. Unexpected hugs. James had always believed that some of the best moments in life were the ones that caught you off guard, the little surprises that reminded you how deeply you were loved. And with Evelyn, one of those moments came in the form of her unexpected hugs, the ones that seemed to happen just when he needed them most. It would happen in the most ordinary of moments, when he was pouring his morning coffee, lost in thought, and suddenly he'd feel her arms wrap around his waist from behind, her body pressing softly against his back as she rested her cheek between his shoulder blades. The first time she did it, he had been caught off guard, nearly spilling his coffee as he chuckled and turned slightly to glance at her. But soon he grew to anticipate them, those little sneak attack embraces that came without warning, without reason, and yet meant absolutely everything. There was something about them that made his chest tighten in the best way, something about the way she would sigh against him, as if holding him was just as much a comfort for her as it was for him. Sometimes she would squeeze him a little tighter before pulling away, running her hands down his arms as if to remind him she was there, always there. Other times she would stay wrapped around him for longer, her lips pressing against his back in a quiet, wordless affection that said more than any love letter ever could. Once, when he had come home after a long, exhausting day, she had greeted him at the door with one of those unexpected hugs, her arms slipping around his neck before he could even set his keys down, her body molding into his like she was meant to fit there. He had closed his eyes in that moment, breathing her in, feeling the way her fingers gently traced over the back of his neck, and suddenly, all the weight of the day had melted away. It was in those moments that he realized love wasn't always about the grand declarations or the carefully planned gestures. Sometimes, it was in the way someone held on to you, the way they wordlessly reminded you that you weren't alone. It amazed him how something so simple could carry so much warmth, so much reassurance, making him feel more grounded than he had in years. Even in public, when they were walking through town or standing in line for coffee, she would reach for him, slipping her arms around his waist, holding on to him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And every time, without fail, he would cover her hands with his own, holding her there, anchoring himself in the quiet security of her touch. He had never known how much he needed those hugs until Evelyn started giving them so freely, so effortlessly, as if they were as essential as breathing. Maybe they were. Maybe love was just that simple. Finding someone who knew exactly when to hold you close and never letting go. Thoughtful text messages. James had never been one to stare at his phone, never felt the need to be tethered to constant messages or digital conversations. But ever since Evelyn had come into his life, he found himself glancing at his screen more often, hoping for one of her thoughtful texts, the kind that always seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment. It wasn't about long-winded love letters or grand confessions. It was the little things, the unexpected messages that reminded him he was on her mind. Sometimes it was as simple as "thinking of you, hope your day is going well," sent in the middle of the afternoon when she knew he was busy. Other times it was playful. A teasing message about the way he always had to straighten the coffee mugs in her cabinet, or a picture of something she saw that reminded her of an inside joke they shared. But his favorites were the ones that came in the quiet moments, the ones that made his chest tighten in that familiar way she always seemed to do. One evening, while he was sitting alone in his den, sipping whiskey and listening to an old record play in the background, his phone lit up with a simple message: "I miss you." It was 3 words, nothing more, but they unraveled something in him, made him set his glass down and exhale, feeling the weight of how much she meant to him. Another time, after a particularly exhausting day, he had collapsed onto his couch, debating whether he had the energy to cook dinner, when his phone vibrated with her text: "I made extra tonight. Want to come over?" And just like that, the day felt easier, lighter, like she had reached across the miles between them and taken some of the burden from his shoulders. There were mornings when he woke up to a simple, "Good morning, handsome," and though he had never been a man who cared much about compliments, the way she said it, typed it, made him feel like he could take on the world. She had a way of making even the mundane moments feel special, of turning an ordinary day into something memorable with just a few words. And though she never expected it in return, James found himself wanting to do the same, sending her little messages when he knew she was busy, just to remind her that he was thinking of her too. One evening, as they sat across from each other at a cozy little restaurant, her phone buzzed on the table and she glanced down, then looked up at him with a smile. He had sent it only seconds earlier, watching as she read the words, "I love you." She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers, no words needed, just the warmth of her fingers against his, a silent understanding that sometimes, the simplest messages held the deepest meaning. The lip bite habit. James had never given much thought to how alluring such a small, unconscious habit could be until he met Evelyn. It was something she did entirely without realizing it, yet every time she bit her lip in concentration, it sent a wave of fascination through him. He first noticed it over dinner one night when she was reading the menu, her eyes scanning the options while her teeth gently tugged at her lower lip. It was a fleeting movement, barely more than a second, but it held him captive, made his breath catch just slightly as he watched her, utterly unaware of the effect she had on him. She did it often, when she was lost in thought, when she was trying to suppress a smile, when she was listening intently to something he was saying. Sometimes she would do it absent-mindedly while flipping through a book, her thumb trailing along the pages as her lip tucked inward, her mind clearly somewhere else. Other times she would bite her lip in amusement, trying to hold back laughter when he said something ridiculous, and that was when he loved it the most. It was a small moment of restraint, an effort to control her emotions, but she never fully succeeded, and he always noticed the way her lips twitched before she finally gave in. It was effortless, unintentional, and impossibly sexy in a way she never seemed to realize. There were moments when he wanted to reach across the table and pull her lip free, to replace her teeth with his own, to kiss away that small, teasing hesitation that made him ache in ways he couldn't quite explain. The way she did it when she was nervous, when she was thinking of the right words to say, only made it more irresistible to him, because it reminded him that beneath her confidence, beneath her poise, there were still moments of vulnerability. Once, while they were slow dancing in the dim glow of her living room, she had looked up at him, her lip caught between her teeth in a way that made his pulse stutter, and he knew then that he was a lost man. He had reached up, brushing his thumb along her lip, watching as she released it, exhaling just slightly, and the space between them had never felt smaller, never felt more charged. She didn't even know she did it, didn't realize how something so small could unravel him so easily, but James noticed. He always noticed. It was one of those tiny, quiet things that made her completely unforgettable, the kind of thing that would sneak into his thoughts even when they were apart. And as he watched her now, across the table, deep in thought as she sipped her wine, that familiar habit making an appearance once again, he smiled to himself, knowing that there were still a million little things about her left to discover, a million more reasons to fall in love with her over and over again. Subtle hand touches. James had always believed that touch was one of the most powerful forms of connection, but he had never truly understood its depth until Evelyn came into his life. She had a way of reaching for him, of making even the smallest touches feel meaningful, and every time her fingers brushed against his, it sent a quiet thrill through him. It wasn't grand or showy. It was in the way she would lightly squeeze his hand when they walked side by side, as if silently reminding him that she was there, that she was his. Sometimes when they sat across from each other at dinner, she would reach for his wrist absent-mindedly, tracing slow, delicate patterns on his skin with the tip of her finger while listening to him talk. Other times it was more deliberate, like when she slipped her hand into his while they strolled through town, her thumb pressing into his palm in a way that made him feel completely grounded. It was in the way she would let her fingertips linger just a little longer than necessary when handing him something, those fleeting moments where their skin barely touched but left behind a warmth that lingered long after. He loved the way she would rest her hand on his thigh when they sat together on the couch, not in a possessive way but in a way that felt like comfort, like home. One of his favorite moments had been when they were driving along the coast, the sound of the waves crashing in the distance, and without a word she had reached over and placed her hand over his on the gear shift, lacing their fingers together without hesitation. That one simple act had sent a rush of emotion through him, a reminder that intimacy wasn't always found in passionate embraces, but in the smallest, most effortless touches. He had never been the kind of man to crave constant affection, but with her he found himself searching for it, waiting for the next moment when she would reach for him without thinking. Sometimes she would brush her fingers along the inside of his wrist while they sat side by side, the softness of her touch igniting something deep in his chest, something almost electric. There were moments when they were in a crowded place, surrounded by people, and she would find his hand, her fingers curling around his in a way that felt secret just for them. He had never told her how much those subtle touches meant to him, how they made him feel seen, cherished, wanted. But he knew she could feel it in the way he always responded, the way he would instinctively pull her closer, his fingers tightening around hers as if holding onto something precious. It amazed him how something so small could hold so much weight, how a simple brush of fingertips could speak more than words ever could. And as he sat beside her now, her hand resting against his, warm and familiar, he realized that sometimes love wasn't about the grand gestures or the spoken promises. It was about the quiet, unspoken moments that lingered long after they passed, the ones that reminded you in the simplest way possible that you were exactly where you were meant to be. Excitement in her eyes. James had seen many beautiful things in his lifetime. The golden glow of a sunrise on a quiet morning, the rolling waves of the ocean stretching endlessly into the horizon, the way autumn leaves painted the world in hues of amber and crimson. But nothing compared to the way Evelyn's eyes lit up when she saw him. It was a look that stirred something deep inside him, a reaction so genuine and unfiltered that it made him feel like the most important man in the world. It wasn't just when he arrived at her door or met her for dinner. It was in the small, unexpected moments, the ones that made his heart swell in his chest. When he surprised her with coffee on a lazy Sunday morning, she had looked up at him with a sparkle in her eyes, as if he had just given her the world. When he walked into the room at a gathering, her face would brighten instantly, like he was the only person she truly cared to see. There were times when they were in the middle of a conversation, and something he said would excite her, her eyes widening, her pupils dilating, her entire face coming alive with joy. He lived for those moments, for the way she made him feel like he mattered, like his presence alone was enough to bring her happiness. It was intoxicating, the way she responded to him without even realizing it, the way her excitement was never forced or rehearsed but completely, beautifully natural. Once, when he picked her up for a weekend trip to the mountains, she had opened the door, and the sheer joy in her expression had stopped him in his tracks. She had hugged him like she hadn't seen him in months, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck, her eyes filled with nothing but warmth. He had never experienced that before, never been on the receiving end of a love so freely given, so openly expressed. And it wasn't just in the happy moments. Even in quiet times when they were sitting together in comfortable silence, he could catch her looking at him like he was something special, like he was worth being excited about. It was humbling, really, to be loved so completely, to be seen in a way that made him feel like a younger, stronger, better version of himself. And yet it wasn't about vanity, wasn't about feeding his ego. It was about knowing that someone, after all these years, still looked at him like he was the best part of their day. He never told her how much it meant to him, never put into words how deeply those little moments affected him, but he hoped she could feel it in the way he kissed her, in the way he held her hand just a little tighter each time. Because in the end, love wasn't about grand gestures or elaborate displays. It was about the simple things, about the way one person could make you feel like you were the most extraordinary thing in their world, just by the way they looked at you. Remembering the little things. James had never met a woman who paid attention the way Evelyn did. It wasn't just that she listened, it was that she remembered, and not just the big things but the little ones, the details that most people let slip through the cracks. It amazed him the way she could recall stories he had told in passing, moments from his childhood that even he had nearly forgotten until she brought them up again. Once, on a chilly evening, she had handed him a steaming mug of hot chocolate, not coffee, not tea, but hot chocolate. The very thing he had once mentioned loving as a boy, the thing his grandmother used to make him after long days spent playing outside in the cold. He had stared at her in quiet disbelief, smiling as he took the first sip, feeling warmth not just from the drink but from the thoughtfulness behind it. She noticed the way he always adjusted his watch absent-mindedly when he was thinking, the way he preferred his eggs slightly runny but never too soft, the way he always ran his fingers along the spines of books before choosing one to read. It was in the way she always picked out his favorite dark chocolates when they went shopping, even though she preferred milk chocolate herself, in the way she knew exactly how he liked his shirts folded, even though he had never once asked her to do it. And it wasn't just about habits, it was about emotions, about knowing what he needed before he even said it. She could sense when he had a long day, when he needed space, when he needed to be held without having to ask for it. Once, after a particularly exhausting week, he had walked into her house to find his favorite jazz record playing softly in the background, a glass of whiskey waiting for him on the table, and Evelyn sitting there with a soft smile, knowing without words that he needed a quiet night. It wasn't about extravagant gestures, wasn't about proving anything. It was simply who she was, someone who loved through actions, through all the little ways she made sure he felt seen, felt valued. And James, a man who had spent most of his life believing he had to carry everything on his own, found himself melting under that kind of love, under the weight of being truly known. He had always thought love was about passion, about chemistry, about the big moments, but now he understood that it was in the smallest things. The way she left handwritten notes in his jacket pocket, the way she remembered which side of the bed he preferred, the way she would hum his favorite song when she thought he wasn't listening. And so he found himself wanting to do the same, wanting to memorize every little detail about her the way she did for him, wanting to make her feel just as cherished in return. Because in the end, love wasn't about the grand declarations, the sweeping romantic gestures. It was about the details, the things only two people in the world knew about each other, the things that made a relationship feel like home. Playful teasing. James had always enjoyed a good sense of humor, but with Evelyn, laughter wasn't just something that happened. It was something they shared, something woven into the fabric of their relationship in a way that made every moment feel lighter. She had a way of teasing him that was never harsh, never meant to wound, but always filled with warmth and affection, the kind that made him feel seen, made him feel alive. It started with small things like the way she poked fun at his need for everything to be in order, calling him Mr. Precise, when he straightened the napkins at a restaurant or adjusted his tie for the third time before they left the house. But then there were the more playful moments, the ones that made his heart swell just as much as they made him laugh. Like when she caught him sneaking an extra cookie from the kitchen and raised an eyebrow, smirking as she said, "So much for that diet you started on Monday, huh?" before stealing one for herself. Or the way she always rolled her eyes when he made a terrible joke, shaking her head with a dramatic sigh before nudging him with her elbow and grinning. Sometimes she would test his patience on purpose, like the time she accidentally moved his car keys from their usual spot just to watch him grumble and search for them, laughing the whole time until he realized what she had done. But the best part was that she could take it just as well as she gave it, and that was what made it so fun. When he called her out for always needing to read just one more chapter before bed but falling asleep 2 pages in, she would huff in mock annoyance before conceding with a laugh. There was a certain intimacy in it, in knowing each other's quirks so well that they could play with them, poke fun at them without ever crossing the line into cruelty. It was that teasing, that playful back and forth that kept them young, kept them engaged, kept the spark alive even in the quiet moments. Once, while cooking together, he had caught her humming off-key to the music playing in the background and had chuckled, saying, "I think we just found the one thing you're not perfect at." She had turned to him, hands on her hips, pretending to be offended before flicking a bit of flour at him, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Those were the moments he treasured the most, the ones that reminded him that love didn't have to be serious all the time, that it could be filled with lightheartedness, with joy, with the kind of teasing that made them feel like kids again. It wasn't about making fun. It was about connection, about knowing someone so deeply that you could joke with them in a way that made them feel even more loved. And as he watched her now, playfully shaking her head at him for something ridiculous he had said, James couldn't help but think that this easy laughter, this effortless joy, was one of the greatest gifts she had ever given him. Taking initiative. James had always been the type of man who took the lead, the one who planned the dates, made the reservations, and handled the little details that made life easier. It wasn't that he minded. He enjoyed taking care of the woman he loved. But with Evelyn things were different. She had a way of surprising him, of taking charge in ways that made his heart race, in ways that reminded him how exhilarating it was to be wanted just as much as he wanted her. It was in the way she would text him first sometimes, something simple like, "I want to see you tonight. My place, 7 p.m. No questions, no hesitation, just certainty, just desire." He loved that about her, the way she made it clear that she wasn't waiting for him to make the first move, that she wanted him just as much as he wanted her. Sometimes it was spontaneous, like the time she pulled him into a slow dance in the middle of her living room, no music playing, just the sound of their laughter mixing with the quiet hum of the evening. Other times, it was more deliberate, like when she reached for his hand under the table at a restaurant, lacing her fingers through his without a second thought. Once after a long day, he had come home to find her waiting on his doorstep, a bottle of wine in one hand and a mischievous smile on her lips. "I figured you could use a distraction," she had said, stepping past him into the house before he could even reply, leaving him standing there, grinning like a man completely and utterly smitten. She didn't just wait for him to set things in motion. She created the moments, the ones that made him feel seen, desired, cherished in a way he hadn't realized he needed. It was intoxicating, the way she took charge in the subtlest of ways, making decisions without waiting for permission, taking his hand and leading him into experiences he never would have sought out on his own. Like the time she insisted they go on a last-minute weekend trip, booking the hotel before he could even protest, dragging him into an adventure that ended up being one of the best weekends of his life. Or the way she kissed him first sometimes, catching him off guard, pressing her lips against his in a way that made his mind go completely blank except for the feel of her, the taste of her, the undeniable proof that she wanted this just as badly as he did. He had spent a lifetime being the one who pursued, the one who initiated, and yet, with her, he found that he loved being on the receiving end of it just as much. She had a confidence that wasn't overbearing but was instead laced with warmth, a quiet certainty that made every moment with her feel exciting, unpredictable, alive. And as he sat across from her now, watching the way she smirked before sending him a message from across the table, "Come closer, I don't bite, unless you ask me to," he couldn't help but think that this ability to take what she wanted, was one of the sexiest things about her. Silly faces and playfulness. James had always appreciated elegance, admired a woman's poise, but what he hadn't expected was how much he would adore Evelyn's ability to be completely, unapologetically silly. It wasn't just the way she laughed at his bad jokes or the teasing remarks she threw his way. It was the way she didn't take herself too seriously, the way she let playfulness seep into even the smallest moments. There were times when she would catch his eye across the room and suddenly scrunch up her nose, sticking her tongue out in a ridiculous expression just to see if she could make him break. And every time, no matter how composed he tried to be, he did. He had always been the one to maintain control, to keep a straight face, but with her that was impossible. She had a way of making everything feel lighter, turning even the most mundane moments into something fun. Like the time they were in the grocery store and she dramatically held up a head of lettuce like it was a trophy, spinning in a circle and announcing, "I have found the holy grail of salads," as if the entire world should stop and admire it. Or the time she put on his reading glasses when he left them on the table, looking over the rim with exaggerated seriousness, pretending to be him as she read the newspaper aloud in a deep, mockingly dramatic voice. It was the way she could turn a rainy day into an impromptu dance in the kitchen, grabbing his hands and twirling under his arm, completely out of rhythm but absolutely perfect in her lack of care for perfection. She would wiggle her eyebrows at him when he was deep in thought, waiting for him to notice and shake his head in amusement, the corners of his lips twitching despite his best effort to remain serious. And then there were the unexpected moments, when they were out at a restaurant and she suddenly made a funny face at him just as he was taking a sip of his drink, causing him to nearly choke on his laughter. He couldn't believe how much he loved that side of her, how freeing it felt to be with someone who reminded him that life was meant to be enjoyed, that love was supposed to be fun. It wasn't about being childish. It was about knowing when to let go, when to let joy take center stage. She knew exactly how to read the moment, when to bring out that playfulness to ease tension, when to flash him a goofy grin just to remind him that life was better when shared with someone who made you laugh. James had spent so much of his life being the responsible one, the one who had to have everything under control, but Evelyn had shown him that sometimes, the best moments were the ones where you simply let go. He realized then that he never wanted to be with someone who was afraid to be silly, someone who only focused on the serious parts of life. He wanted this laughter, this joy, this woman who could turn any ordinary moment into something unforgettable with just a well-timed funny face. Small acts of care. James had always been the type of man who took care of others, who prided himself on being dependable, but with Evelyn he found himself on the receiving end of something he hadn't even realized he'd been missing. Small, thoughtful acts of care that spoke volumes without a single word. It was in the way she smoothed the collar of his shirt before they left the house, her fingers lightly brushing against his neck as she adjusted it just right, not because he asked her to, but because she wanted him to look his best. It was in the way she placed her hand on his lower back when they walked through a crowd, a subtle but protective gesture that made him feel as if she was silently saying, "I'm here with you." He noticed it when she made sure to refill his glass of water before he even realized it was empty, or when she kept an extra scarf in her car just in case he forgot his on a cold night. She didn't make a big show of it, never pointed out the ways she took care of him, but he noticed, he always noticed. Once, when he had mentioned offhandedly that he hadn't been sleeping well, he arrived at her house to find fresh chamomile tea and a soft, new pillow waiting for him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for her to anticipate what he needed before he even asked. She made sure his favorite coffee was always stocked in her kitchen, even though she preferred tea, and she never forgot the way he liked it. 2 sugars, just a splash of cream, stirred exactly 3 times. When they went out to eat, she would casually slide the bread basket toward him, knowing he always reached for it but never wanted to take the last piece. She would absent-mindedly brush away a crumb from his sweater or fix his tie, the kind of small, effortless touch that made his chest tighten with something warm and unspoken. She never hovered, never smothered, but she always paid attention, always made sure he was comfortable, always made sure he felt cared for in ways he hadn't even realized he needed. One night, when he had been feeling under the weather, she had shown up at his door with homemade soup, her warm hands pressing against his forehead as she scolded him for not telling her sooner. He had chuckled at the way she fussed over him, but deep down, it had touched something in him, something that had been starved for that kind of tenderness. It wasn't about grand gestures or extravagant displays. It was about the small, quiet ways she showed him she loved him every single day. The way she reached for his hand while they sat together, the way she draped a blanket over him when he dozed off on the couch, the way she checked in on him when she knew he was having a tough week. James had spent so much of his life being the strong one, the one who carried the weight, but Evelyn had shown him that love wasn't about carrying everything alone. It was about knowing that someone was there to lighten the load, even in the smallest, most unexpected ways. Holding on to his arm. James never thought much about the way people walked together until Evelyn slipped her hand through the crook of his arm one evening, and suddenly something so simple became something he never wanted to go without. It wasn't just the physical closeness that sent warmth through him. It was the feeling of being needed, of being chosen in that small but deliberate way. She did it instinctively, without hesitation, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to link herself to him. The first time it happened, they had been strolling through town after dinner, the crisp night air curling around them, when she reached out and gently wrapped her fingers around his forearm, holding on to him as they walked. He had glanced at her in surprise, but she hadn't even noticed, too busy admiring the twinkling lights strung across the storefronts. There was something about it that felt intimate, protective in a way he hadn't anticipated, not because she needed him to guide her but because she wanted to be close. It was different from holding hands. This was something deeper, something that felt like trust. He began to notice that she did it often, slipping her arm through his whenever they were together, her touch light yet unwavering, her grip firm enough to let him know she was there. When they walked through crowded places, she would press a little closer, holding on to him as though anchoring herself in the chaos around them. He found himself loving the way she fit against his side, the way she made it clear that she was his and he was hers without ever saying a word. It wasn't just outside either. Sometimes when they were at home she would link arms with him while they moved about the kitchen, resting her head briefly against his shoulder before letting go. Once, during a long afternoon at the farmer's market, she had held on to him the entire time, squeezing his arm occasionally when she found something she liked, her excitement vibrating through him as she led him from stand to stand. It amazed him how something so small could hold so much meaning, how it could make him feel stronger just by knowing that she wanted to be connected to him. He had never asked her why she did it, but he didn't need to. He could feel the answer in the way she leaned into him, in the way she sighed contentedly whenever she slipped her hand into place. It wasn't about balance or support. It was about comfort, about intimacy, about the unspoken declaration that she felt safe with him. And he, in turn, felt a sense of purpose, a quiet pride in knowing that she trusted him enough to hold on to him in that way. He found himself missing it when she wasn't beside him, his arm feeling oddly empty, like something essential was missing. Love wasn't just in grand gestures or passionate declarations. Sometimes, it was in the simplest things. A hand wrapped around an arm, a presence that whispered "I'm here with you," a silent promise held in the warmth of a touch. Cute nicknames. James had always been a man who preferred straightforwardness, but with Evelyn he found himself softening in ways he never expected, especially when it came to the little names she had for him. It started subtly, almost without him realizing it, a casual handsome, thrown into conversation, a teasing Mr. Serious when he furrowed his brow while reading the newspaper. At first he had chuckled, shaking his head at her playfulness, but over time he found himself waiting for them, secretly loving the way she made even the simplest words sound like affection. She had a name for him in every mood: darling when she was feeling particularly sweet, love when she was distracted but still wanted to acknowledge him, and grumpy when he was brooding over something trivial. He hadn't realized how much he had grown to adore it until one evening, when they were apart for a few days, and his phone lit up with a message that simply read, "Miss you, handsome." He had stared at it longer than he should have, a small smile tugging at his lips, his heart warming at the idea that she thought of him even in the simplest moments. There was something intimate about it, the way she made even a single word feel like a quiet confession, a way of saying "I see you, I love you" without actually saying it outright. He found himself returning the favor, calling her beautiful when she least expected it, throwing in a troublemaker when she was particularly mischievous. Once, when they were cooking together, he had muttered something about how she always managed to get flour on her nose, and she had turned to him with a smirk, wiping her hands on her apron before poking his chest. "Don't act so surprised, sweetheart," she had teased, her voice full of warmth, and James had felt something in his chest tighten, something deep and unshakable. He loved the way she made even the most mundane moments feel like inside jokes, like they had their own language that no one else could quite understand. When they were in public, she would sometimes lean in close and whisper, "Hey, handsome," in his ear, her voice full of mischief, and no matter how many times she did it, it always made his stomach flip just a little. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the way she said them, the way she made him feel like he was special, like he was hers. He had spent years thinking love was about big moments, about grand gestures, but Evelyn had shown him that it was in the smallest things. The playful way she called him darling when she was trying to get her way, the affectionate old man when he groaned about his aching back, the soft "my love" when she thought he was asleep but still reached for him anyway. And as he sat across from her now, watching her sip her wine with that knowing smile, he realized that no matter what name she called him, they all meant the same thing. He was hers and she was his, and sometimes, love was as simple as a name spoken in just the right way. Shoulder resting. James had never realized how much comfort could be found in something as simple as Evelyn resting her head on his shoulder until it became a quiet ritual between them. It would happen in the most ordinary moments, on the couch after a long day, at the park bench while they watched the sunset, or in the dim glow of a movie theater when the film had lost her interest but being close to him hadn't. She would shift slightly, lean into him, and without hesitation, let her head settle against his shoulder like it was the most natural place in the world for her to be. He had never questioned it, never needed to, because every time she did it he felt something unspoken pass between them, something steady and reassuring. The first time it happened, they had been sitting on his back porch with coffee in hand, watching the rain drizzle against the wooden railing. She had sighed, her body relaxing as she leaned in, and before he could even think about it, his arm had instinctively wrapped around her, holding her there as if she belonged. She had murmured something soft, something he didn't quite catch, but the warmth of her breath against his skin had made his chest tighten in a way that was both grounding and exhilarating. He loved how she did it so naturally, so effortlessly, as if she had no doubt that he would hold her, no hesitation in letting herself relax into him completely. It wasn't a grand gesture, wasn't a declaration of love spoken aloud, but it was something deeper. Something that said, I trust you, I feel safe with you. There were times when they sat in silence for long stretches, her head resting against him, his fingers brushing absent-mindedly over her arm, neither of them needing to fill the quiet with words. He noticed the little things when she did it. The way she sighed softly as if letting go of the world, the way her fingers would sometimes find his hand and link with his, the way she would shift just slightly closer when she thought he wasn't paying attention. It made him feel strong in a way he never had before, not because she needed him but because she chose him as her place of rest. It was different from any kind of touch he had known. There was no urgency in it, no expectation, just the quiet kind of love that existed without effort. Once, at an outdoor concert, she had leaned into him in the middle of a song, her hair brushing against his jaw, and he had found himself wishing the moment would never end. He had thought about telling her how much it meant to him, how much he adored the way she trusted him enough to let go, but instead he had simply pressed a kiss to the top of her head, hoping she understood. And maybe she did, because later that night as they sat in the car, she had reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly before resting her head against his shoulder once again. In that moment he realized that love wasn't always about passion or excitement. It was about this, about having someone who knew exactly where they belonged and about knowing without a doubt that you were the one they wanted to lean on. Genuine compliments. James had always been the type of man who brushed off compliments with a casual nod or a quick change of subject, never quite knowing how to respond when someone praised him. But with Evelyn it was different. Her compliments weren't empty words or polite gestures. They were thoughtful, sincere, and always seemed to catch him off guard in the best way. It wasn't just the way she told him he looked handsome when he dressed up for dinner or the way she playfully complimented his cooking, even when he knew she was only being kind. It was the way she noticed the little things about him, the things no one else had ever taken the time to acknowledge. One evening, as they sat across from each other at a dimly lit restaurant, she had tilted her head slightly, studying him with a soft smile before saying, "You have the kindest eyes, you know that?" He had paused mid-sip, completely caught off guard by the way she said it, as if she had just shared some great truth about him that he had never even considered. Another time, after he had spent hours fixing the leaky pipe under her sink, she had wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing a kiss to his cheek before murmuring, "You always know how to take care of things. I love that about you." It was such a simple thing to say, but he had felt it settle deep in his chest, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the work he had just done and everything to do with the way she saw him. She didn't just compliment his appearance, though she did that often, and each time it made him feel 10 years younger. She complimented his character, his patience, his way of making her feel safe and understood. She had a way of making him feel appreciated in ways he never even realized he needed, like the time she had caught him deep in thought and said, "I love the way your mind works. I could listen to you talk all day." He had laughed, brushing it off, but later that night as he lay in bed, he found himself replaying her words, letting them settle into the spaces where doubt had once lived. There was something about the way she spoke to him, the way she never exaggerated or said things she didn't mean, that made every compliment feel like a gift, like something he could carry with him long after she said it. He had spent most of his life believing that men weren't supposed to need reassurance, but Evelyn had shown him that everyone, no matter how strong or independent, needed to be seen, to be acknowledged. And so, he started returning the favor, telling her how beautiful she looked even when she was in her old pajamas, how much he admired the way she always made people feel at ease, how much he loved the way she lit up when she talked about something she was passionate about. Because he had come to realize that love wasn't just about attraction or companionship. It was about making sure the person you cared for never doubted their worth, never wondered if they were enough. And with Evelyn, he knew one thing for certain. She had made him feel more than enough every single day. The lingering look. James had always believed that words carried the most weight, that what people said to one another was the foundation of connection. But then there was Evelyn, and she had proven him wrong in the most unexpected way. She had a way of looking at him, of holding his gaze just a little longer than necessary, that made him feel something deep and unshakable in his chest. It wasn't just a glance or a passing moment. It was deliberate, meaningful, and spoke more than words ever could. Sometimes it was playful, like when he caught her watching him over the rim of her wine glass, a teasing smile playing at her lips before she slowly looked away, leaving his heart pounding. Other times, it was warm and affectionate, the kind of look that settled into his bones, like when she watched him from across the room at a party, her eyes soft with admiration, as if she were silently telling him how much she loved being by his side. But the looks that affected him the most, the ones that lingered in his mind long after they happened, were the ones filled with quiet intensity, the ones where she gazed at him as if memorizing every detail of his face, as if he were something rare, something worth savoring. He would catch her doing it when they were sitting in comfortable silence, her eyes tracing the curve of his jaw, the lines near his eyes that deepened when he smiled. He had never had anyone look at him like that before, like he was important, like he was worth slowing down for. It wasn't the kind of stare that made him self-conscious, but rather the kind that made him feel seen, deeply and completely, in a way that went beyond physical attraction. One evening, as they sat by the fire, her head resting against his arm, he turned to find her already watching him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. He felt the warmth of it before she even spoke, before she reached up to cup his cheek and whispered, "I love looking at you, you know that?" And he did know. He had felt it in every unspoken moment, in every lingering glance, in every quiet second where no words were needed because her eyes said everything. It wasn't about vanity or admiration. It was about connection, about the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. He found himself doing it too, watching her when she wasn't paying attention, letting his gaze linger on the curve of her smile, the way her fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of her coffee cup, the way her hair fell over her shoulder in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. And in those moments he realized that love wasn't just about the things people said to one another. It was about the things they showed, the silent confessions passed between them when no one else was looking. Because sometimes, the deepest emotions weren't spoken. They were seen, felt, and understood in the lingering look of someone who loved you enough to truly see you.